I had 72 hours to decide whether I want to keep my fence or my dog. That was a choice written between the lines of the violation, notice taped crookedly to my front door, flapping in the cold March wind. The paper rattled every time the breeze hit, like it was impatient for my answer, while the street around me stayed painfully quiet except for the low hum of distant traffic. I remember staring at that notice and thinking that this was it, the moment my normal little life turned into a full-blown homeowners association drama. If you have ever heard a wild HOA revenge story, you know they usually start small. Some little power trip, some petty rule, someone with a clipboard who enjoys telling other people no. Mine started with a simple 6-foot fence and a 70-pound rescue dog who thought he was a lap puppy. I did not realize that, to the vice president of our association, those two things were unforgivable sins that needed to be punished. At first, I just stood on the porch, fingers going numb around the edge of that notice. A 72-hour ultimatum. Bring the fence down to approved height, or remove my dog from the property until further review. No hearing, no conversation, no warning, just a deadline and a threat that more violations would follow. I did not know yet that buried in those lines, dated March 12th, was a crack in their power they did not want me to see. I wish I could say that I calmly walked inside and made a rational plan. The truth is, my ears rang, my stomach dropped, and I had that tight feeling in my chest you get when someone swings at something you love. Through the front window, I could see my dog, Bear, sprawled on the living room rug, tail thumping lazily when he spotted me. He had no idea a stranger with a clipboard had just decided he was dangerous. Even in that first moment, though, beneath the panic, something else was burning. This was not just about vinyl panels and a big dog. It was about control, about someone deciding what my home should look like and who I was allowed to share it with. I did not know how yet, but I understood one thing as I stepped back inside and shut the door behind me. They had picked the wrong homeowner to corner with a countdown, and that ticking 72-hour clock was not going to end the way the vice president expected. To really understand how we got to that notice, you have to see the street the way I saw it when I first moved in. Our cul-de-sac looked like any background from a real estate brochure. Tidy lawns, maple trees lining the sidewalk, beige siding as far as the eye could see. On a clear day, the sun bounced off the identical vinyl siding, so hard you had to squint walking past the houses. It was the kind of place where neighbors waved in a half-friendly, half-assessing way, and where the association newsletter arrived more often than actual mail from friends. I bought my house at the end of the street, in the curve of the cul-de-sac, with a slightly bigger lot that backed up to a drainage ditch and a strip of trees. It was not fancy, but it was mine, and after a rough year I wanted two things: privacy and a dog big enough to make me feel less alone. The HOA existed in the background at first, just neat pamphlets and a thick binder of CC, and ours the previous owner left in a kitchen drawer. I skimmed some of it, saw a lot of numbered sections in legal language, and did what most people do. Told myself I would read it later and never did. The board at that time was made up of a handful of familiar faces I recognized from jogs around the loop. There was a president who seemed friendly enough, a treasurer who always looked like he had somewhere better to be. And then there was the vice president. I will call him Mr. V, because he moved to the neighborhood like a capital letter, sharp and upright and hard to ignore. He lived 2 houses over, always in a pressed polo, always watching the street like it was a stage built for him. The first time I saw him, he was walking slowly down the sidewalk, hands clasped behind his back, inspecting everything. He paused to glare at a trash can left too close to the curb, frowned at a basketball hoop, and mentally logged every infraction with the intensity of someone checking security footage. Later, a neighbor mentioned in a low voice that he took his role on the board very seriously, especially the rules about pets and fences. At the time, I laughed it off, assuming that many liked things neat, not that he enjoyed turning minor issues into crusades. Bear entered the picture a few months later, when the air turned cold and the trees along the ditch were bare. I found him at the local shelter, a brown and white mutt with big paws and bigger eyes, listed as mixed breed, possible shepherd cross. He had the kind of face that made you want to apologize for whatever he'd been through before you showed up. The staff said he'd been returned twice for being too high energy and too big for the apartment. But all I saw was a dog who needed a yard and someone who would not give up on him. I brought him home just before the first snow. The first night, he paced the house, nails clicking on the hardwood, then curled up against the back door, as if guarding it from something only he could see. In the morning, when I let him out, he bounded into the thin layer of snow like a kid discovering winter for the first time, leaving wild little tracks across the yard. Watching him that morning, with his breath foggy in the air, I realized the waist-high chain-link fence the previous owner had installed was not going to cut it. Bear could easily lean his front paws over it, and I had visions of him vaulting into the street after a squirrel or a passing jogger. I wanted him safe, and I wanted privacy from the constant eyes of the cul-de-sac, including the ever-watchful vice president. So I did what seemed sensible. I called a contractor and asked about a taller, solid fence along the back and sides of my yard, something that would keep Bear in and the world out. The contractor mentioned we might need HOA approval. I remembered the binder, shrugged, and figured that if the old fence had been fine, the new one would be too, as long as it looked decent. I submitted a simple application form, with a sketch and the fence company's brochure attached, sliding it into the metal box outside the clubhouse. Weeks passed, snow fell and melted, and I heard nothing. No email, no letter, no denied stamp across my paperwork. The contractor, backed up with other jobs, told me he would schedule me for early spring, and I told myself that no news meant good news. When the thaw finally came, the ground turning from hard frost to muddy earth, the crew showed up. They ripped out the old wire fence and set posts for a 6-foot wood fence. Clean and plain, nothing fancy, stained in neutral brown. By the end of the week, Bear had a secure yard where he could race from one end to the other without worrying me, and I had my own little pocket of privacy at the end of the cul-de-sac. For the first time since moving in, my backyard felt like my space, not just part of the HOA's carefully curated display. I noticed a shift almost immediately after the fence went up. On the first warm Saturday, as the sound of a distant lawnmower droned across the cul-de-sac, Mr. V slowed his daily patrol walk in front of my house. He stood there longer than usual, eyes moving up and down the fence line, taking in every board, every post, every inch above the old height. He did not say anything to me directly, but the air around him felt sharp, like static building before a storm. Over the next few days, subtle things started to happen. I got a friendly-looking flyer about maintaining community aesthetics tucked into my mailbox, featuring a photo of an approved fence that was noticeably shorter than mine. An email went out to the entire neighborhood, reminding residents to review pet policies and fencing guidelines as spring approached. At the bottom, signed in crisp digital font, was the name of our vice president, along with a note about increased compliance checks. At first, I brushed it off and told myself I was being paranoid. The crew had used standard materials. The fence was a basic color, and plenty of other houses had tall trees or hedges that blocked views more than my fence ever would. Besides, Bear was thriving. He spent his days sniffing along the fence line, chasing birds from one corner to another, and sleeping hard at night, finally burning off the restlessness that had gotten him labeled too much for his previous homes. Still, I could not ignore the sensation that the fence had painted a target on my house. Neighbors mentioned that Mr. V had brought up a recent unapproved fence in passing at a board meeting, in that annoying way where the example somehow never needed a name. One neighbor told me he saw the vice president in my yard while I was at work, measuring the fence with a metal tape, scribbling numbers in a little notebook. Hearing that, I felt my chest tighten. It was one thing to walk the sidewalk, another to step onto my grass without asking. I had no idea then that this obsession with inches and boards was just his opening move, and that he would soon use my dog, my privacy, and even the calendar itself as tools to push me into a corner he assumed I would never fight my way out of. Not long after those measurements, Bear became part of the conversation. He had a deep bark, the kind that echoed across the yard, but he used it sparingly. Most of the time he was quiet, content to patrol the fence like a security guard, and then flop in a sunny patch of grass. But one afternoon, a delivery truck rattled up the street and stopped in front of my driveway, and Bear started barking in that protective way dogs do. I stepped outside to bring the package in and saw Mr. V standing across the street, watching intently as Bear trotted along the fence, tail up but body relaxed. The driver waved to me, clearly not afraid, but the vice president's expression hardened like he was mentally adding dangerous animal to his list. Later that week, an email went out about large breeds and aggressive barking disturbing the peace, once again without naming names, but the timing was hard to miss. Instead of letting it go, I felt that spark of anger again, because I knew Bear. He was big, yes, but no more dangerous than any other dog on the block. From that point, it felt like my house was under surveillance. I would catch glimpses of Mr. V walking slower past my yard, lingering near the property line, pretending to inspect the sidewalk while clearly eyeing the fence and listening for any sign of Bear. He attended every board meeting with a thick stack of papers and a red pen, and people started whispering that he was drafting clarifications to the pet rules. I tried to keep living my normal life, but it is hard to relax in your own home when you know somebody is just waiting for you to slip. The funny thing about these stories is that when you are in them, they feel like a slow drip, not a sudden flood. There was no single explosion, just a series of tiny, petty actions that gradually shifted the ground under my feet. The fence, the emails, the way neighbors started asking careful questions about Bear's breed and weight, as if somebody had been seeding doubts in their minds. I kept telling myself that if I followed the basic rules, kept my yard clean, and made sure Bear was always on a leash off property, things would settle down. But the vice president was not looking for peace. He was looking for a case. Every bark, every inch of wood, every shadow cast by my fence was data for him, numbers and impressions he could twist into a narrative of noncompliance. And on March 12th, when the last of the snow finally melted into muddy streaks along the curb, that narrative arrived on my door in the form of an official notice. It was labeled, "First Violation, Immediate Action Required," printed on association letterhead with my name, and address centered under a neat black logo. The date, March 12th, sat in the corner like a stamped verdict, and underneath it were two separate sections, one for unapproved fence height and one for potentially dangerous dog. The language was sterile and cold, but the message was clear. My fence was too tall by their interpretation of the guidelines, and my dog, by their assessment, posed a risk to the community. At the bottom, in bold, was that 72-hour deadline to correct the issues or face escalating fines, potential legal action, and the possibility of further restrictions. Taped beside the notice was a photocopy of what looked like a page from the association's CC and RS. The section about fences, highlighted in yellow, referred vaguely to a maximum height consistent with neighborhood standards without any numbers. The pets section, underlined in red, mentioned vicious animals, and the board's right to restrict them, but nothing about barking, size, or breed. Yet somehow, from this vague language, the vice president had built a case strong enough to justify telling me to tear down my fence or get rid of Bear, all within 3 days. I pulled the notice down and carried it into the kitchen, heart pounding. The clock over the stove ticked loudly, as if it had joined on the countdown. Bear trotted over, nudging my hand with his nose, sensing something off in the way I moved. I sank into a chair at the table. The paper spread out in front of me like a test I had never studied for. For a few minutes, I did nothing but read. I read the summary of alleged violations, the references to bylaw sections, the threats of remedies, including, but not limited to, fines and liens. I read the part that insisted I had erected the fence without approval, even though there had never been a denial letter, and I read the line that described Bear as a large, aggressive animal whose bark has caused fear and distress among neighbors. It was as if the board and I lived on different streets. Near the bottom, above the bolded deadline, I noticed a signature. It was not the president's. It was a vice president's, carefully printed with a flourish, as if he wanted everyone to know exactly who had made this decision. Seeing his name there, more than anything else, snapped something awake in me. I could have reacted the way he expected, panicking, tearing down the fence, scrambling to find a temporary home for Bear, apologizing for existing outside his comfort zone. Instead, I felt that burning line between fear and anger settle into something sharper. This was not just a neighborly disagreement anymore. It was a power play, and he had decided I would be the example he used to tighten his grip on the community. If I backed down, I knew I would not be the last. So I picked up the notice, smoothed it out, and carried it to my little home office at the back of the house. The room was dim, lit only by the gray daylight coming to the blinds, and the desk lamp cast a yellow circle over my laptop keyboard. I set the notice down next to the old CC&R binder the previous owner had left behind, its plastic cover cracked but still holding together. For the first time since moving in, I opened it with the intention of reading every word that mattered. The binder was dense. Sections on parking, trash cans, landscaping, architectural standards, pets, noise, and enforcement. Buried in the middle was a section titled Enforcement Procedures, and that was where I saw the first crack. Before any fines or drastic measures, the board was supposed to issue a courtesy notice, provide an opportunity to correct, and, in disputes, offer a hearing if requested in writing. None of that had happened. Instead, I had jumped straight to immediate action required, signed by a vice president who seemed to have skipped half his own process. I flipped between the binder and the photocopied page from the notice, comparing line by line. The language on the photocopy did not match word for word. Some sentences were cut off, and one line seemed to be missing altogether. It looked like someone had cherry-picked the most convenient parts of the rules and presented them as the entire story. If this notice was meant to scare me into immediate obedience, it was starting to have the opposite effect. The section on pets sent me down another rabbit hole. It talked about vicious animals in the context of repeated attacks or bites, not barking or size alone. It referenced local animal control statutes and said the association would defer to those laws in determining whether a pet was dangerous. That meant there were rules beyond the HOA's binder, rules the vice president either did not expect me to look up or assumed I would be too overwhelmed to find. I opened my laptop and started searching for our city's animal control ordinances. The text was long and dry, but clear on one point. A dog could not be labeled dangerous without specific incidents, documented complaints, or an investigation. There were processes, appeals, and standards of proof. None of it sounded like what the vice president had done when he decided that Bear's existence behind a tall fence was enough to write the word dangerous into an official notice. I glanced back at the violation, at the date, at the 72-hour countdown already ticking in my head. This was bigger than one fence and one dog. It was about whether the board could twist vague language into whatever shape suited its mood. If they could do it to me, they could do it to anyone who dared to be a little different on this otherwise uniform loop of houses. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a new line formed. This might become one of those neighbors from Hell stories, but I was not willing to be the victim in it. The room felt smaller as evening crept in, the shadows stretching across the floor. Outside, I could hear cars returning from work, garage doors opening and closing, the everyday soundtrack of our little cul-de-sac. None of my neighbors knew that on my desk sat a notice that could change everything about how we all lived here. None of them knew that the vice president had just given me a reason to learn the rules better than he ever expected. The notice had framed things like there were only two options, obey or face punishment. But that night, as I highlighted lines in the CC and RS and bookmarked the city's animal control statutes, a third option started to take shape in my mind. I could follow the rules more carefully than the people enforcing them. I could take their own language, their own procedures, and use them to push back. I did not know yet exactly how I would do it. I did not know how messy it would get, or how many meetings I would sit through, or how many sideways looks I would collect in the process. All I knew on that quiet March night with Bear asleep at my feet and the violation notice pinned to my corkboard was that I was not going to let one man with a title and a clipboard decide what kind of home I was allowed to have. The countdown had started, but so had something else. The next morning, I woke up with that notice still sitting in my mind, like a weight on my chest. The kitchen felt colder than usual as the early light slid through the blinds, turning the violation on my corkboard into a bright rectangle of accusation. Bear stretched and shook his collar, the tiny jingle cutting to the quiet while a furnace hummed in the background. For a minute, I just stood there with my coffee, staring at the words, immediate action required, and thinking about what action actually meant for someone who was tired of being pushed around. The first thing I did was check the clock and count the 72 hours from the date printed on the notice. They had taped it to my door in the late afternoon on March 12th, which meant my theoretical deadline fell on a Sunday evening when nobody in the office would be answering phones anyway. It felt intentional, like they wanted a countdown to run out while I scrambled without support, so they could say I had failed to comply. That alone told me everything I needed to know about how the vice president played this game. I sat down at my desk and opened a blank document. If they wanted things in writing, then I would give them something they could not ignore. I drafted a calm, almost formal letter acknowledging receipt of the notice, disputing the claim that my fence was unapproved, and requesting a hearing under the Enforcement Procedures section of the CC and RS. I also challenged a label on Bear, pointing out that there had been no bite reports, no documented incidents, and no contact from the city's animal control office. It felt strange, writing about my own dog like he was a legal argument instead of a living, breathing creature who snored on my couch. But I knew that if I let emotion lead, they would dismiss me as irrational and digging harder. So I used their language, section numbers, and phrases like good faith and procedural fairness, all pulled from the binder they assumed I had not read. When I finished, I printed it, signed it, and scanned a copy for my records, because if this home turned into an HOA nightmare, I wanted a trail they could not erase. On my way to the clubhouse drop box, I felt every small sound on the street more sharply than usual. A car door closing, a distant leaf blower, the faint rhythm of someone's music drifting from an open garage. Halfway down the sidewalk, I saw Mr. V stepping out his house, collared shirt pressed, clipboard in hand as always. His eyes drifted from the envelope in my hand to the direction I was walking, and his lips pressed into a thin line that almost passed as a smile. We did not speak, but the air between us felt crowded. I kept my pace steady, slid the envelope into the metal slot, and listened to it hit the bottom with a soft metallic thud. On the glass door, a notice about the upcoming board meeting was taped in place. The date circled in red, March 20th. Underneath it, in smaller font, an agenda item read Enforcement Procedures Review and in parentheses, Executive Session Confidential. That little parenthetical was my first real confirmation. Somewhere behind closed doors, my fence and my dog had become topics important enough for executive session. I took out my phone and snapped a quick picture of the agenda. It was another piece of this puzzle, another small evidence prop in what was starting to feel like a case file rather than a simple disagreement. When I walked back home, Bear's paws thumped against the inside of the door, and I felt a rush of determination not to let his future be decided in a room where I was not welcome. The board did not respond to my letter that day, or the next. Instead, an automatic email popped into my inbox acknowledging receipt of your correspondence, with no mention of a hearing. I checked the CC and RS again, and saw that they had a set number of days to schedule one once a homeowner requested it in writing. While I waited for any sign of that, the clock on the supposed 72-hour ultimatum kept ticking down, a deadline that now seemed even more arbitrary considering the uprooted process. Those 3 days dragged and sped by at the same time. Every time I let Bear out, I watched the street, half expecting to see someone else on the board standing there with a camera or a measuring tape. The neighborhood felt different now, like the calm surface had been peeled back and the gears underneath were exposed. In the late afternoon, the sky turned a flat gray, and a light drizzle started tapping on the fence. Each drop a tiny reminder of the time I was supposed to be using to undo my own yard. On the second day, an email finally arrived from the association manager. Buried halfway down the message was a single line confirming that I would be placed on the agenda for a hearing at the next board meeting. There was no apology for skipping the courtesy steps, no acknowledgement that the initial notice had jumped ahead in the process. But that line was enough. It meant they could not claim I had ignored them when I refused to bulldoze my backyard or ship my dog away by their arbitrary deadline. Of course, the violations did not go on hold just because I had asked for a hearing. On the community portal, a new entry appeared under my account, showing a pending fine schedule if non-compliance continued. It was not astronomical yet, but the numbers added up quickly, started with a flat fee and then adding daily charges after a certain date. The message underneath was clear. Even while they were pretending to be fair, they would keep tightening the financial screws. I sat at my desk and stared at the screen, heart thumping in my ears louder than the rain against the window. This was the money angle, the part where they expected me to cave, because It is one thing to argue about rules and another to watch dollar signs stack up beside your name. I thought about my mortgage, my budget, and the way unexpected expenses always seem to hit at the worst times. For a moment, the idea of giving in tugged at me, quiet and insidious. But the more I saw those numbers, the more I realized that if I backed down now, I would be teaching them that all they had to do to get their way was weaponize fines and threaten my stability. And I refused to be the homeowner who proved that tactic worked. In the days leading up to the March 20th board meeting, I did my own kind of campaigning. I started talking to neighbors, not in a dramatic way, but in the casual conversations that happened over mailboxes and garbage cans. I mentioned the notice, not hiding the details, and asked if anyone else had gotten similar letters or felt pressure about fences, pets, or anything else. What surprised me was how quickly stories bubbled up once someone was willing to say out loud that the board felt different since the vice president had taken a more active role. Some neighbors complained about nasty notes left for leaving holiday decorations up too long. Others mentioned being called out for small things like a flower pot that did not match the approved color palette or a car parked an inch over an invisible line. A few had received reminders about barking dogs, even though nobody had bothered to talk to them first. It felt like the entire cul-de-sac had been living under a slow, constant pressure that everyone had gotten used to, the way people get used to a low background noise until someone finally asks if anyone else hears it. I could tell most of them were uncomfortable taking a firm side. They had kids to raise, jobs to keep, and no energy for a full-blown battle with the people in charge of their neighborhood. But more than one person told me, in their own careful way, that they thought the fence looked fine and Bear seemed like a good dog. That was enough for me. I did not need a crowd behind me. Just the knowledge that this narrative of a giant, menacing dog behind an ugly wall did not match what people were actually seeing. A couple of days before the meeting, I logged back into the portal and found a new document posted, the board packet for the upcoming session. Most of it was mind-numbing detail about landscaping contracts and reserve funds, but buried near the back was an executive session summary with short bullet point. Lot 17, fence and pet enforcement discussion. Possible policy update. I took screenshots of the entire section, including the timestamp, because I knew information like that had a way of disappearing once people realized homeowners were paying attention. The phrase policy update bothered me. It suggested that instead of admitting they had overreached, they might try to change the rules retroactively to justify what they had already done. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse parking lot was busier than usual. Headlights swept across the low brick building, and a faint buzz of voices leaked out the glass doors whenever someone walked in or out. Inside, the fluorescent lights gave everything a washed-out look, and the smell of coffee from a metal urn in the corner mixed with the scent of paper and carpet cleaner. I signed in on a clipboard at the entrance, wrote Lot 17 next to my name, and took a seat near the back where I could see the entire board table. The president sat in the middle, leafing through papers, flanked by the treasurer on one side and Mr. V on the other. The vice president had already lined up a stack of documents, highlighters placed just so, as if he were preparing for trial rather than a community meeting. He glanced up once, eyes scanning the room, and I watched his expression shift when he saw me there. It was a quick, flickering thing, but I recognized it for what it was, surprised that I had shown up at all. The first part of the meeting was routine. They talked about snow plowing expenses and landscaping bids while I sat there, aware of the low hum of the heating vents and the scratch of pens on paper. Neighbors drifted in and out, some staying just long enough to hear if dues were going up, others clearly there because of simmering grievances of their own. When the agenda moved to the section labeled Homeowner Hearings, I felt my shoulders tighten and I sat up straighter. My name came up second. The president explained in smooth practice language that the board would listen, ask questions, and then discuss the matter in executive session. I had only a few minutes to summarize why I thought the violation notice was flawed, unfair, and out of step with the very rules they claimed to follow. So I focused on the parts they could not easily spin. The missing courtesy notice, the vague fence height language, and the fact that no city agency had ever investigated or labeled Bear as dangerous. I spoke calmly, refusing to let my voice shake even when my heart was racing. I explained that the fence had been installed after an architectural request That was never denied, and I pointed to the portion of the CC and RS that said requests were considered approved if not responded to within a set time frame. I mentioned that the notice's photocopied page did not match the full text of the pet section, and that their binder itself referenced deferring to city statutes for animal classifications. I stopped short of accusing anyone of twisting the rules, but I made it clear I had read them closely. From the corner of my eye, I could see Mr. V stiffen. When I quoted section numbers, he probably thought nobody but the board had memorized. He shuffled his papers, tapped his pen, and finally asked a question about bear size and barking habits. His tone polite on the surface, but loaded underneath. I answered factually, mentioning Bear's weight, his training, and the lack of any actual incident reports. When I finished, I requested again on the record that any enforcement be paused until the board could verify compliance with both the CC and RS and the relevant city statutes. They thanked me in that distant way people do when they have already made up their minds but have to go through the motions. Then they moved on to the next homeowner, and I sat there, acutely aware of the ticking clock on the wall and the rustle of people shifting in their chairs. When the open session ended and they asked non-board members to leave for executive session, I stepped out into the chilly night with everyone else. The wind cut across the parking lot, and for a moment I just stood there, watching the lights in the clubhouse windows and imagining my life being debated in that fluorescent glow. By the time that meeting wrapped, I had gone from confused homeowner to reluctant amateur expert in our governing documents, standing up to a vice president who seemed determined to make an example out of my fence and my dog. I had requested a hearing, challenged their interpretation of the rules, and forced them to discuss my case in a room they never expected me to understand. But the real battle over how far their power reached was just getting started. What happened next did not come as a formal announcement or a phone call. A few days after the meeting, a new notice showed up in my mailbox, this one stamped final in thick black letters. The paper was heavier, the tone even colder, and the fines now had specific dollar amounts attached, with an escalation schedule that could easily turn into hundreds over a few weeks. At the bottom, they acknowledged my hearing but maintained that I remained out of compliance, reaffirming the demand that I bring the fence down and temporarily remove Bear until further evaluation. Attached to the notice was a one-page policy clarification slip. It included a new line about fences not to exceed 5 feet in height. In backyards, a number that had never appeared in the original CC and RS I had highlighted on my desk. In smaller font at the bottom, it said the board reserved the right to clarify ambiguous rules as needed to preserve community standards. Seeing that, I understood they had not admitted a mistake. They had adjusted the rules after the fact and tried to act as if they had always been that way. It was a slick move, and I could see how it might have worked on someone too busy or overwhelmed to cross-check every document. But I still had the original text, the dates on the portal, the screenshot of the board agenda, and the timestamp on the new clarification. Taken together, they painted a picture of a board, and a vice president in particular, who wanted to expand their power quietly without anyone noticing. My frustration hardened into something close to resolve. Around the same time, the social angle kicked in. I started hearing from neighbors that my situation had become a topic of discussion in informal gatherings and group chats I was not part of. Some people wondered why I was making such a big deal over what they had heard described as a simple height adjustment and some barking complaints. Others have been told that my dog had frightened multiple residents, a claim that did not match anything anyone had said to my face. It became clear that the vice president was not just using rules and fines. He was shaping the story in a way that painted me as unreasonable. I felt in the way some people started avoiding eye contact when I walked Bear on a leash around the block. In the overly bright smiles of others who suddenly wanted me to know how much they appreciated the board's hard work keeping the neighborhood nice. The pressure was no longer just financial. It was social, the soft isolation that comes when someone in power suggests you are a problem. On more than one evening, as the streetlights flickered on and the air smelled faintly of wet grass, I wondered if it would be easier to give in just to make it stop. But giving in would not just affect me. If the board could rewrite the rules midstream, label a dog dangerous with no evidence, and lean on fines and gossip to force compliance, then none of my neighbors were safe from the same treatment. This was bigger than my fence. It was about boundaries in every sense of the word. The more I thought about it, The more this saga started to look like the kind of homeowners association drama people only believe when they hear it secondhand. But I was living every page of it. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse parking lot was busier than usual. Headlights swept across the low brick building, and the faint buzz of voices leaked out the glass doors whenever someone walked in or out. Inside, the fluorescent lights gave everything a washed-out look, and the smell of coffee from a metal urn in the corner mixed with the scent of paper and carpet cleaner. I signed in on a clipboard at the entrance, wrote Lot 17 next to my name, and took a seat near the back where I could see the entire board table. The president sat in the middle, leafing through papers, flanked by the treasurer on one side and Mr. V on the other. The vice president had already lined up his stack of documents, highlighters placed just so, as if he were preparing for trial rather than community meeting. He glanced up once, eyes scanning the room, and I watched his expression shift when he saw me there. It was a quick, flickering thing, but I recognized it for what it was, surprise that I had shown up at all. The first part of the meeting was routine. They talked about snow plowing expenses and landscaping bids while I sat there, aware of the low hum of the heating vents and the scratch of pens on paper. Neighbors drifted in and out, some staying just long enough to hear if dues were going up, others clearly there because of simmering grievances of their own. When the agenda moved to the section labeled Homeowner Hearings, I felt my shoulders tighten and I sat up straighter. My name came up second. The president explained in smooth practice language that the board would listen, ask questions, and then discuss the matter in executive session. I had only a few minutes to summarize why I thought the violation notice was flawed, unfair, and out of step with the very rules they claimed to follow. So I focused on the parts they could not easily spin. The missing courtesy notice, the vague fence height language, and the fact that no city agency had ever investigated or labeled bears dangerous. I spoke calmly, refusing to let my voice shake even when my heart was racing. I explained that the fence had been installed after an architectural request that was never denied, and I pointed to the portion of the CC and RS that said requests were considered approved if not responded to within a set time frame. I mentioned that the notice's photocopied page did not match the full text of the pet section, and that their binder itself referenced deferring to city statutes for animal classifications. I stopped short of accusing anyone of twisting the rules, but I made it clear I had read them closely. From the corner of my eye, I could see Mr. V stiffen when I quoted section numbers. He probably thought nobody but the board had memorized. He shuffled his papers, tapped his pen, and finally asked a question about bear size and barking habits, his tone polite on the surface but loaded underneath. I answered factually, mentioning bear's weight, his training, and the lack of any actual incident reports. When I finished, I requested again, on the record, that any enforcement be paused until the board could verify compliance with both the CC and RS and the relevant city statutes. They thanked me in that distant way people do when they have already made up their minds but have to go through the motions. Then they moved on to the next homeowner, and I sat there, acutely aware of the ticking clock on the wall and the rustle of people shifting in their chairs. When the open session ended and they asked non-board members to leave for executive session, I stepped out into the chilly night with everyone else. The wind cut across the parking lot, and for a moment I just stood there, watching the lights in the clubhouse windows, and imagining my life being debated in that fluorescent glow. By the time that meeting wrapped, I had gone from confused homeowner to reluctant amateur expert in our governing documents, standing up to a vice president who seemed determined to make an example out of my fence and my dog. I had requested a hearing, challenged their interpretation of the rules, and forced them to discuss my case in a room they never expected me to understand, but the real battle over how far their power reached was just getting started. What happened next did not come as a formal announcement or a phone call. A few days after the meeting, a new notice showed up in my mailbox, this one stamped final in thick black letters. The paper was heavier, the tone even colder, and the fines now had specific dollar amounts attached, with an escalation schedule that could easily turn into hundreds over a few weeks. At the bottom, they acknowledged my hearing but maintained that I remained out of compliance, reaffirming the demand that I bring the fence down and temporarily remove bear until further evaluation. Attached to the notice was a one-page policy clarification slip. It included a new line about fences not to exceed 5 feet in height. In backyards, a number that had never appeared in the original CC and RS I had highlighted on my desk. In smaller font at the bottom, it said the board reserved the right to clarify ambiguous rules as needed to preserve community standards. Seeing that, I understood they had not admitted a mistake. They had adjusted the rules after the fact and tried to act as if they had always been that way. It was a slick move, and I could see how it might have worked on someone too busy or overwhelmed to cross-check every document. But I still had the original text, the dates on the portal, the screenshot of the board agenda, and the timestamp on the new clarification. Taken together, they painted a picture of a board and a vice president in particular who wanted to expand their power quietly without anyone noticing. My frustration hardened into something close to resolve. Around the same time, the social angle kicked in. I started hearing from neighbors that my situation had become a topic of discussion in informal gatherings and group chats I was not part of. Some people wondered why I was making such a big deal over what they had heard described as a simple height adjustment and some barking complaints. Others have been told that my dog had frightened multiple residents, a claim that did not match anything anyone had said to my face. It became clear that the vice president was not just using rules and fines. He was shaping the story in a way that painted me as unreasonable. I felt it in the way some people started avoiding eye contact when I walked Bear on a leash around the block. In the overly bright smiles of others who suddenly wanted me to know how much they appreciated the board's hard work keeping the neighborhood nice. The pressure was no longer just financial. It was social. The soft isolation that comes when someone in power suggests you're a problem. On more than one evening, as the streetlights flickered on and the air smelled faintly of wet grass, I wondered if it would be easier to give in just to make it stop. But giving in would not just affect me. If the board could rewrite the rules midstream, label a dog dangerous with no evidence, and lean on fines and gossip to force compliance, then none of my neighbors were safe from the same treatment. This was bigger than my fence. It was about boundaries in every sense of the word. The more I thought about it, the more this saga started to look like the kind of homeowners association drama people only believe when they hear it secondhand, but I was living every page of it. So instead of folding, I decided to widen the field. If the CC and RS referenced city statutes, then I needed to know not just what they said, but how they were enforced. I gathered my notes. The March 12th violation, the board packet screenshots, the final notice dated early April, and my own annotated copy of the pet and fence sections. With that small stack of paper in hand, I started planning my next steps. The shift into retaliation did not feel dramatic at first. It felt methodical. One rainy afternoon, with a steady drum of drops against the office window, I called the city's animal control office and asked about the process for declaring a dog dangerous. The person on the other end explained in calm, procedural terms that such a designation required documented incidents, official reports, and, usually, an investigation where both parties could give input. When I gave them my name and address, they checked their system and confirmed there were no records involving Bear at all. That conversation became another piece of evidence for my growing file. I wrote down the date, the time, and the name of the person I spoke with, then saved it beside my other documents. It confirmed what I had suspected. The board had leapt ahead of the city's own process, using their own fear-skewed judgment instead of any objective standard. It also gave me a clear reference I could bring back to them, one that would make it very hard for them to argue they were simply following the law. Next, I drafted a formal letter to the board, summarizing everything I had learned. I pointed out that the new fence clarification had been issued after my installation, referenced my screenshot of the earlier version, and highlighted the section stating that changes could not be applied retroactively to projects already completed with implied approval. I cited the conversation with animal control and the city's own criteria for dangerous dogs, noting that no such process had been followed with Bear. I ended by requesting not just that my fines be put on hold, but that the entire enforcement action be reconsidered in light of their procedural missteps. I knew that letter alone would not magically fix everything. The vice president had invested too much of his own authority in this situation to simply back down because a homeowner had done her homework. But I was not just fighting a single violation anymore. I was laying groundwork. If this turned into a longer conflict, I wanted a clear record showing that I had been reasonable, thorough, and firmly within my rights. What I did not realize yet was that this quiet, Paper-based pushback would eventually spill past the board table and into the larger neighborhood, forcing everyone to decide whether they were comfortable living under one man's version of order or ready to help pull his authority back where it belonged. Word of my letters and board challenges did not explode in some dramatic announcement. It seeped through the neighborhood like water finding every crack. I started getting quiet knocks at my door in the evenings, usually when the sky was fading to blue and the porch lights were flickering on one by one. Neighbors who had smiled stiffly before began stopping by, wanting to know more about what was happening with my fence, my dog, and the fines. They always looked over their shoulders as if the association itself might be listening, which told me just how deep the fear of crossing the board really ran. One couple admitted they had received a final notice about their patio furniture color, dated just a few days after mine, with the same heavy language about escalating fines. Another neighbor showed me a crumpled letter about a small playset in their yard, with a handwritten note in the margin that looked suspiciously like Mr. V's tight script. The pattern was becoming obvious. People were being pushed from small, fixable issues into high-pressure ultimatums without much room for conversation. It was not just me. The vice president's vision of order was squeezing the entire cul-de-sac. As residents started comparing notes, I could feel something shift. What had begun as a lonely fight over one fence and one dog was turning into a broader unease about how far the board's authority could reach. I kept my tone calm whenever we talked, laying out dates, documents, and sections rather than venting anger, because I did not want this to look like a personal grudge. This had to be about process, fairness, and boundaries, or it would be too easy for the board to dismiss us as complainers. With every news story, my file grew thicker. The final notice dated April 3rd for my fence and dog sat alongside copies of other neighbors' letters, each one stamped with a different date but carrying the same heavy-handed phrasing. I printed the board agenda excerpt that mentioned policy clarification draft, April 5th, and highlighted a line about enforcement procedures. It was becoming less like a simple complaint and more like a case study in how power, once stretched, rarely snaps back on its own. Around this time, I realized that waiting for the board to quietly correct itself was wishful thinking. They had doubled down already, and the vice president in particular seemed to feed on the idea that he was the one holding the neighborhood together by force of will. If anything was going to change, it would have to come from the homeowners, using the same governing documents the board waved around at everyone else. So one evening, with Bear sleeping at my feet and the street outside humming softly with distant traffic, I opened the CC and RS again, this time flipping to the section most homeowners never think about, how to change the board itself. The language was dry, but powerful in its own way. Buried among paragraphs about terms and vacancies were clauses about recall, petitions, and special meetings. If a certain percentage of homeowners signed a petition, the board was required to hold a meeting to discuss the removal of an officer or changes to specific policies. It did not promise success, but it created a path that did not start and end at the board table. I sat back in my chair and stared at that section for a long moment. Up until then, my focus had been on clearing my own name and protecting Bear. Now, the possibility of doing something bigger crept in. It felt ambitious, risky, and a little unreal, the kind of twist people expect to hear about in an HOA revenge story rather than live through themselves. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt like the logical next step in dealing with someone whose authority had gone unchecked for far too long. There was still a looming question, though. If I used the association's own rules to force a special meeting, would I simply embarrass myself in front of a crowd? Or was I about to drag the vice president's careful image into a light he could not control anymore, with real consequences attached to every page in my growing file? I did not leap into petitions overnight. Instead, I started small, drafting a clear, simple summary of what happened so far and what I believed needed to change. I wrote it like a report. Dates of notices, sections of the CC and RS, the post dated fence height clarification, and the mismatch with city animal control procedures. At the end, I laid out a proposal. Rescind enforcement actions against my fence and Bear, formally correct the process for all homeowners, and, if necessary, consider whether the vice president should continue in his position. Then I went door to door, not as someone stirring up drama, but as a neighbor asking people if they were comfortable with how things had been handled. I kept my tone measured, never raising my voice, even when recounting the 72-hour ultimatum that had forced me into this fight. At each house, I left a copy of my summary and asked if they would read it and decide whether they wanted to sign a petition requesting a special meeting to discuss enforcement abuses and board leadership. Some people signed right away, pen pressing hard into the paper like they had been waiting for this moment. Others asked for time, and a few declined, not wanting to get involved. It took a couple of weeks, long enough for the trees along the ditch to bud into a bright, hesitant green. Dogs barked in backyards. Lawnmowers started making their first passes of the season, and the cul-de-sac looked normal on the surface again. Behind that calm, though quietly folded sheets of paper were moving from house to house, picking up signatures one by one. When I finally tallied them all at my kitchen table, finger tracing each name, I realized we had passed the threshold required by the CC and RS to force that special meeting. I made copies, signed my own name at the bottom as the lead homeowner, and delivered the packet to the association manager's office, this time with a witness from the neighborhood by my side. The manager's expression was professionally neutral, but I saw the flicker of surprise when they counted the pages. I knew this would have to be reported to the board as more than just another complaint. It was now a formal, documented request backed by a chunk of the community. Whatever the vice president thought of me personally, he would not be able to dismiss this as one homeowner whining about a fence. The notice of the special meeting went out a week later. It arrived by email and paper mail, printed on the same letterhead they use for violation notices. But the tone was different. It said the homeowners had requested a meeting to discuss enforcement practices, recent policy clarifications, and concerns regarding board leadership. No names were given, but everyone on the street knew who would be at the center of that conversation. The evening of the special meeting, the clubhouse felt packed in a way I had never seen before. Cars lined the street outside, headlights bouncing off the curb of the cul-de-sac as residents filtered in, stamping the lingering chill off their shoes. Inside, the fluorescent lights glared off a row of metal folding chairs, and the murmur of voices filled the room like distant static. I could smell coffee again, but there was an edge of nervous energy in the air that no amount of caffeine could smooth over. I took a seat near the middle this time, petition copy in my bag, file folder resting on my lap. Bear stayed home, curled up in his usual spot, unaware that a room full of people were about to debate his fate along with the fate of the rules that had labeled him dangerous. At the front table, the president looked tense, the treasurer avoided eye contact, and the vice president's shoulders were so stiff they looked carved from stone. He had his usual stack of papers, but tonight my stack matched his. The president opened with a prepared statement about community unity and respectful dialogue, phrases that sounded practiced and a little hollow in the charge room. Then the floor was open for homeowners to speak, and for a moment, nobody moved. You could hear the faint hum of the air vent and the shuffle of someone adjusting in a folding chair. Then a neighbor from 2 doors down stood up, papers in hand, and everything changed. One by one, residents began to share their own experiences. They talked about notices with impossible deadlines, fines that escalated before they could even understand the issue, and policy clarifications that seemed to appear only after the board had already decided someone was in the wrong. They were careful with their words, but the pattern was clear. People felt policed, not supported. Each story laid another brick in the wall of evidence, showing that this was not an isolated conflict between one homeowner and the vice president. When it was my turn, I stood and laid my file on the podium. I walked through the timeline, the unacknowledged fence application, the March 12th violation notice, the missing courtesy step, the animal control statutes that were supposed to guide pet decisions but had been bypassed. I held up the original CC&R fence section, highlighting the absence of a 5-foot restriction, and then the policy clarification draft, April 5th, that inserted it after my fence had already been built. I did not accuse anyone of lying. I let the dates and documents sit side by side and speak for themselves. Next, I read a short excerpt from the city's animal control guidelines, the part stating that no dog could be classified as dangerous without specific incidents reports and due process. I reminded the room that, according to the city, bear did not exist in their system at all, which meant the association had effectively created its own private label of dangerous with no official backing. The vice president shifted in his seat jaw tight, but stayed silent while I spoke. When I finished, I calmly requested that the enforcement action against my fence and my dog be reversed, and that the board put in place a clear, transparent process aligned with both the CC and RS and city law. That was when the questions began. Homeowners wanted to know who had authored the policy clarification, who had decided to skip courtesy notices, and why some violations arrived with 72-hour ultimatums while others got weeks to respond. The president tried to frame it as a misunderstanding, a matter of interpretation, but the room did not seem satisfied with that anymore. It became clear that the vice president had been the driving force behind the stricter interpretations and rapid escalations. When he finally spoke, his words were clipped and defensive. He referenced community standards and risk management, pointed to his volunteer hours, and insisted he had only ever acted in the best interest of the neighborhood. He tried to reframe my situation as exceptional, implying that my fence and bear size created a unique issue. But every time he leaned on generalities, someone in the room brought the conversation back to specifics: dates, sections, notices, and the growing pile of documents in homeowners' hands. After nearly an hour of discussion, the president proposed that the board move into a brief recess to confer. They left the table, papers in hand, and disappeared into the adjoining room, leaving the rest of us sitting under the two bright lights and buzzing vents. Time stretched. People whispered quietly, compared letters, and shifted in their chairs. I sat there gripping my folder, feeling the weight of every step that had led to that moment. When the board returned, the president's expression had changed. He announced that, after reviewing the documentation and hearing from the homeowners, the board had decided to rescind the enforcement action against my fence and remove any association designation of bear as dangerous. There would be no fines, no requirement to lower the fence, and no limitations on my dog beyond the existing city laws that apply to everyone. A relieved murmur rippled through the room, but the meeting was not over yet. The president then admitted that the process for issuing notices had not always followed the courtesy and hearing steps outlined in the CC and RS. Going forward, he said, the board would adopt a written enforcement policy to be posted publicly that enforced those steps consistently. He also acknowledged that the fence clarification had been issued after the fact and promised that no rule change or clarification would be applied retroactively in the future. It was a rare moment of institutional humility, but even that did not fully close the door on what had been set in motion. Several homeowners, emboldened by the board's concessions, requested that the petition's final item be addressed: the question of whether the vice president should remain in his role. The room fell quiet again, the air feeling heavy and still. The president shifted uncomfortably, clearly reluctant, but the petition's language and the turnout gave him little room to avoid it. He announced that the board would allow a non-binding vote of confidence from the homeowners present, which, while not officially removing anyone, would carry significant weight. Ballots were passed out, simple slips of paper asking whether the homeowners supported the vice president continuing in his role. People filled them out in silence, the soft scrape of pens loud in the quiet room. When the votes were collected and tallied at the front table, you could feel tension thick enough to almost touch. The final count was not close. A clear majority expressed no confidence in the vice president. The president read the result aloud, his voice steady but somber, and for the first time that night, Mr. V looked smaller, less like an unshakable authority, and more like a person who had pushed too far for too long. He did not argue or grandstand. He simply sat there, shoulders slumping slightly as the reality settled around him. The president then announced that, in light of the vote and concerns raised, the vice president had offered his resignation from his position on the board, effective immediately. There was no cheering. This was not a movie. But there was a long exhale from the room, a collective release of pressure that had been building for months. People looked at one another, some nodding, some just staring down at their hands, absorbing the fact that the power structure they had taken for granted was not as immovable as it seemed. For the first time, it felt like the association belonged to the homeowners again, not just the people at the front table. In the weeks that followed, the changes became visible in quieter ways. The board posted a formal enforcement policy on the portal, complete with timelines, courtesy steps, and a requirement that any policy changes be recorded with dates and shared before taking effect. They created a small committee of residents to review the pet rules specifically, making sure they align with city law and protected responsible owners rather than punishing them. At the first meeting of that committee, someone half-jokingly mentioned my case as the reason they were all there, and everyone knew they were right. Bear's life returned to something like normal. He patrolled the yard, barked at the occasional squirrel, and napped in the same sunny patches he had claimed from the beginning. Neighbors greeted him by name now, some slipping him treats through the fence, as if to make up for the weeks when his very presence had been framed as a threat. My fence stood exactly where it had been built, tall enough to keep him safe and solid enough to remind me that boundaries, once defended, can become symbols rather than just structures. I kept my file, even after the fines were erased and the labels removed. Inside were the dated notices, the board agenda excerpt, the policy clarification draft, April 5th, and the notes from my call with animal control. It was not that I expected another fight right away. It was that I had learned how fragile the line between reasonable governance and overreach could be when nobody watched. Having those papers meant I would never again be starting from zero. Sometimes, when I walked the cul-de-sac in the evening, I thought about how easily this story could have gone the other way. If I had panicked and taken the fence down, or sent Bear away for now, the vice president's version of events would have solidified into fact, and the board would have learned that pushing harder always worked. Instead, enough of us pushed back, using their own rules, their own dates, and their own language to bring things back into balance. It was not about humiliating one man. It was about reminding the association that power in a neighborhood is supposed to serve the people who actually live there. The whole experience changed how I saw my home. The house itself had not moved an inch. The ditch still ran behind the fence. The same maple trees still rustled along the sidewalk. But I no longer saw myself as just a name on a dues list at the mercy of whoever held a title at the top of a newsletter. I was part of the community that could ask questions, demand clarity, and, when pushed, pull power back into the sunlight where it belonged. On quiet nights, when the streetlights cast soft yellow pools on the pavement and the air smelled of cut grass, I sometimes thought about how this would sound told from a distance. Stripped down to its outline, it might look like classic care-neighbor drama, or just one more small-town conflict blown way out of proportion. But for the people who lived on our little loop, it was something more. Proof that even in a small corner of the world, fairness does not have to be a rumor. Sometimes it can be written, dated, and voted on right there under the bright hum of a clubhouse ceiling. Tell me your own fence and dog HOA horror in one sharp sentence. Next time, I want to tell you about another cul-de-sac, one where the board decided holiday lights were a safety hazard and started sending out warnings before the pumpkins were even off the porches. It starts with a single string of twinkle lights, a threat to cut,